1947. The KKK kidnapped Bumpy Johnson's wife. They gave him 7 days to beg. He gave them 7 days to disappear one by one. No bullets, just terror. When a king stops talking, who decides, who lives? The sun hadn't cleared the tenements yet when Officer Marcus Webb found it a midnight blue Cadillac Series 62 engine cold, driver's door hanging open like a broken jaw. It sat on 125th and Lenox, right where Harlem's morning should have been waking up with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Instead, the street held its breath. No vendors, no kids, just silence thick enough to choke on. Metallic and wrong, like blood left too long in the air. Webb circled the car slowly, his hand never leaving his holster. The leather seats were pristine except for one detail that made his stomach drop a thin smear across the passenger side. Dark and dried, no wider than a thread. He crouched down, following it with his eyes until he saw the drag marks. 2 parallel lines in the dirt. Shallow but deliberate, leading from the car to the curb, and then nothing. Whoever left those marks had been pulled, not walked. Then he saw, pinned under the windshield wiper like a parking ticket from hell, a square of white fabric. Crude stitching forming 3 letters that didn't need explanation. K, K, K. Not hidden, not whispered. Displayed. This wasn't a crime scene. This was a declaration of war, signed and delivered to the one man in Harlem who could read between every blood-soaked line. Webb's partner, a rookie named Sullivan, reached for the fabric. Webb slapped his hand away hard enough to bruise. Don't touch a goddamn thing. You understand me? Not a thread. Not a drop. You see what this is? Sullivan stared, confused, and Webb leaned in close enough that the kid could smell yesterday's whiskey on his breath. This isn't evidence. This is a lit match dropped in a room full of gasoline. We file this wrong, and tomorrow morning we're scraping bodies off these streets with shovels. The report that hit the precinct captain's desk 2 hours later said one word: kidnapping. Not assault, not abduction with racial motivation, not domestic terrorism. Just kidnapping, clean and bureaucratic. The kind of word that keeps federal agents in Washington and lets local cops pretend they didn't see the match getting struck. Captain Halloran read it twice, then locked it in his desk drawer. When Webb asked if they were opening an investigation, Halloran looked at him like he'd suggested walking into a furnace. We file it. We don't follow it. The woman they took, do you know whose wife that is? Webb nodded slowly. Everyone in Harlem knew. Mamie Johnson, Bumpy's wife. The one person in the entire borough who could walk through the roughest blocks at midnight without a single hand reaching toward her purse. Not because she was protected, because touching her meant touching him. And touching Bumpy Johnson meant choosing a very specific way to stop existing. Halloran lit a cigarette, his hands shaking just enough to notice. The KKK just kicked down the door to the most dangerous man in New York and took the only thing he loves more than power. You think they're stupid. You think this is random. He exhaled smoke like he was trying to breathe out the weight of what was coming. They're not trying to scare him. They're trying to break him, make him beg, make him bend. And when Bumpy Johnson bends, when he shows the world he's mortal, that's when this city tears itself apart. Webb understood then. The silence on 125th Street wasn't shock. It was anticipation. Harlem was holding its breath because it knew what happened when gods bled. He looked at the Cadillac one last time before they towed it to the impound lot where it would sit, untouched, gathering dust and questions. No one wanted answered. The drag marks were still there in the dirt. The fabric was bagged but not processed, and somewhere, in a basement or a warehouse or a farmhouse just outside the city, a woman sat in darkness wondering if her husband would come for her or if he'd come for revenge first. Webb walked back to his patrol car, got in, and sat there for a long moment with his hands on the steering wheel. His partner asked if they should canvass the neighborhood, knock on doors, look for witnesses. Webb just shook his head. There are no witnesses, not ones who'll talk, because everyone who saw something is busy calculating whether their loyalty to justice is worth more than their desire to keep breathing. He started the engine, pulled away from the curb, and tried not to think about what the next 7 days would bring. Tried not to imagine the phone calls that would come in the middle of the night reporting bodies found in alleys, fires in abandoned buildings, men who disappeared between their front doors and their cars. Tried not to remember that he'd sworn an oath to protect and serve, and that oath was about to be tested in ways the Academy never prepared him for, because the men who took Bumpy Johnson hadn't just kidnapped a woman. They'd kidnapped order itself. They'd taken the one thing that kept Harlem's violence organized and purposeful instead of chaotic and consuming. And in Harlem, order had a face, a name, and a very long memory for men who thought they could break it without consequences. The Cadillac sat in impound for 3 days before someone finally processed it. By then, it didn't matter. By then, the message had been received, decoded, and answered in a language older than courtrooms and more permanent than laws. By then, men were already running. The warehouse smelled like violence waiting to happen, stale pall-malls, mildew eating through floorboards. And underneath it all, the sour metal tang of old blood that never quite washes out of concrete. 12 men sat in a circle, their faces hidden under white hoods that made them look less like crusaders and more like ghosts of men who died angry and refused to stay buried. The single bare bulb overhead swung on a frayed cord, casting shadows that moved like they had their own intentions. The man who spoke first didn't raise his voice because men who are truly dangerous never need to shout. His tone was boardroom smooth, corporate, the kind of voice that signed eviction notices and foreclosure papers without a tremor of conscience. Gentlemen, let us be absolutely clear about our methodology here. We are not engaging in murder. Murder attracts federal attention. Murder creates martyrs, and martyrs create movements. What we're creating is much simpler. We're creating submission through surgical application of psychological pressure. A younger voice interrupted, raw with the kind of hatred that gets nurtured in basements and bar rooms until it metastasizes into action. Psychological pressure. We got his woman locked in a root cellar and you're talking like we're running a business seminar. This ain't Wall Street. This is war. The young man stood up, fists clenched. He's taken everything our territory, our respect, our rightful place in this city. And you want to negotiate? I say, we send him pieces. Start with a finger, then an ear. Make him understand. The smooth voice cut through like a scalpel through skin. Sit down. 2 words, but they carried the weight of money, of connections, of power structures that existed long before any of them were born. The young man sat. You think sending body parts makes us strong, it makes us animals. And animals get hunted. No. We keep her alive. We keep her unharmed. And we wait for Bumpy Johnson to do what every powerful man does when something he loves is threatened. We wait for him to show weakness. He continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. To negotiate. To offer us terms. And when he does, when he stands in front of us with his hat in his hands asking for mercy, that's when we own him. That's when Harlem learns that their king bleeds. Then another voice emerged from the shadows at the edge of the circle. So calm it was almost conversational. Strike the family, gentlemen. The king falls. Always. It's not conjecture, it's historical inevitability. Powerful men protect their empires by any means necessary. but they protect their families through compromise, through weakness. The voice paused, letting the words sink in like poison into soil. Johnson will negotiate because he'll convince himself it's strategic. But really it's because love makes even the strongest men into beggars. The hooded men turned toward the voice, but the speaker remained in darkness. This was the financier, the architect, the man whose money had rented this warehouse, purchased the intelligence, funded the entire operation. He didn't wear a hood because he didn't need the costume. His anonymity came from offshore accounts and lawyers who specialized in making paper trails disappear like morning fog. I'm not here for ideology. I'm here because Bumpy Johnson controls 70% of Harlem's revenue streams, and monopolies are inefficient. They need to be broken, violently if necessary, legally if possible, but always methodically. He stepped forward just enough that the light caught his shoes' Italian leather, recently polished, the kind that cost more than most of the men in this room made in a month. On the table, he placed an envelope. Inside you'll find addresses, schedules, patrol routes, and the locations of his safe houses. Everything you need to apply pressure at precisely calibrated intervals. Don't deviate, don't improvise, and above all, don't underestimate him. His voice dropped to something colder than winter. Bumpy Johnson didn't build his empire by being merciful. He built it by being smarter than everyone who tried to take it from him. But intelligence has limits. Emotion doesn't. And right now, his emotions are about to become our greatest asset. The shoes turned and walked back into shadow. This operation has 3 phases: acquisition, which we've completed, pressure, which begins now, and negotiation, which will happen when he realizes that raw power can't save what he loves most. Follow the plan. Trust the timeline. And remember that the most successful wars are won before the first shot is ever fired. One of the hooded men opened the envelope with trembling fingers, scanned the documents inside, and his voice came out hoarse. This is inside information. Deep inside. Who gave you this? No answer. Just the sound of a door closing and footsteps fading into the night. Because the most dangerous men don't answer questions, they just set events in motion and collect the profits when the bodies stop falling. The remaining men sat in silence, studying the documents, each one understanding that they'd just become pawns in a game much larger than racial hatred or territorial disputes. This was about money, about real estate, about the kind of power that doesn't announce itself with violence, but with legal briefs and zoning laws and the slow, grinding erosion of everything you thought you owned. And somewhere in that warehouse, in a room they weren't allowed to enter, Mamie Johnson sat in darkness and counted the hours, knowing that her husband was coming, but not knowing whether he'd come as a savior or an executioner. The office on Lenox Avenue had the particular silence of a church before a funeral, heavy and expectant. Thick enough that it pressed against your eardrums and made your pulse sound like thunder. Bumpy Johnson sat behind a desk, scarred with cigarette burns and knife marks from 2 decades of deals made and threats delivered. His hands folded with the kind of stillness that made people nervous, because stillness from Bumpy meant someone's name had just been written on a list that didn't get erased. Freddie Lucas stood across from him, shifting weight from foot to foot like a boxer waiting for the bell. "Boss, we got eyes on the precinct. Webb filed it as a kidnapping. No mention of who took her. No task force. No federal involvement. They're treating it like it's already cold." He paused, waiting for rage, for orders, for the explosion everyone knew was coming. Instead, Bumpy's voice came out quiet as midnight. "Good. Let them think I'm waiting for their help. Let them think I'm following procedures like a citizen who believes in justice." Raymond, leaning against the wall with a .38 bulging under his jacket, couldn't stay quiet. "Boss, with respect, Every hour she's out there is another hour they could be. He stopped because Bumpy had looked up, and his eyes had gone flat and black as river stones. Could be what? Raymond hurting her. You think I don't know that you think I'm sitting here calm because I don't care. He stood up slowly, walked around the desk with the deliberate pace of a man counting the steps to someone's grave. I'm calm because rage is a luxury I can't afford. Rage makes you stupid, makes you kick down the wrong doors and shoot the wrong people. And when you're hunting men who think they're ghosts, you can't afford to be stupid even once. He spread photographs across the desk, surveillance shots taken over weeks. Faces captured in profile outside churches and hardware stores, license plates, addresses written in neat handwriting. These men think anonymity protects them. They think wearing hoods makes them invisible. But everyone has patterns. Everyone has habits. His voice took on the quality of a professor delivering a lecture on murder. Everyone has a wife or a mother or a child they kiss goodnight, and patterns, gentlemen, are how predators find prey. His finger tapped one photograph, a man in his 50s. Beer gut. Work boots. This one buys menthol cools every Tuesday at the same bodega. This one, another tap. Goes to confession every Saturday at St. Augustine's. And this one drinks himself stupid every Thursday at a bar in Queens where he thinks nobody from Harlem will ever look. Freddie stared at the intel, realization dawning slow and cold. You've been watching them. For how long? Bumpy didn't answer directly because the answer would have revealed just how far ahead he'd been planning, that you didn't survive 3 decades in Harlem by being reactive. You survived by knowing who wanted you dead before they knew it themselves. That afternoon, Bumpy did something no one expected. He went back to where Mamie's car had been found, alone. No guards. No weapons visible. Just him and the empty street that still smelled faintly of her perfume mixed with fear sweat and gasoline. He walked the scene like a detective, but his methods were older than police work. He was reading the ground the way his grandfather had taught him to read tracking signs in Alabama dirt back when staying alive meant knowing who'd passed through and how recently. The drag marks were still visible, 2 shallow gouges where her heels had scraped asphalt. He crouched, touched the marks, brought his fingers to his nose. Boot leather, steel-toed. Military surplus. Probably. The kind sold at Army-Navy stores to men who wanted to feel dangerous without enlisting. He followed the marks with his eyes until they disappeared into the alley, then saw it a cigarette butt, crushed but recent, still holding the ghost of menthol. He picked it up, rolled it between his fingers, and smiled without any warmth in it whatsoever. Because cigarettes were regional, menthols were a choice, and choices led to stores, which led to neighborhoods, which led to men who thought they'd been careful, but hadn't been careful enough. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the spot where his wife had been taken, and something shifted in his chest. Not rage, not fear, but something colder and more permanent. A decision forming itself like ice crystals in winter air. This wouldn't be solved with bullets sprayed wildly into the dark. This would be solved with patience, with precision, with the kind of methodical dismantling that left no doubt about cause and effect. When he returned to Lenox Avenue, the clock on the wall was still ticking, but it wasn't marking time anymore. It was counting down. 7 days. Not because finding Mamie would take 7 days, because dismantling the entire network of men who thought they could touch his family would take exactly that long. 7 days to identify every conspirator. 7 days to isolate them from their support systems. 7 days to make each one understand that they'd signed their own death warrants the moment they decided Bumpy Johnson's love was a weakness they could exploit. He gathered his men in the back room, spread the photographs and notes across the table like a general planning a siege. Gentlemen, for the next 7 days, we're not gangsters, were surgeons, every cut precise, every move calculated, no collateral damage, no innocent blood. He looked each man in the eye, making sure they understood the difference between revenge and justice, between rage and retribution. We're going to take apart the organization that thought it could break me, piece by piece, man by man, until the only people left standing are the ones smart enough to understand that some lines exist for a reason, and crossing them has consequences that echo through generations. When Bumpy went silent, Harlem understood someone was about to disappear. The only question was how many and how completely. Tommy Red Kellerman was halfway through changing his oil filter when the garage door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into darkness so complete he couldn't see his own hands. His heart kicked against his ribs like a trapped animal because the door hadn't fallen, someone had pulled it down, hard and deliberate, the chain rattling like bones in a jar. He scrambled backward, knocking over a toolbox that crashed with a sound like cymbals in a funeral march. And his voice came out high and strangled. "Who's there? I got a gun. I swear to Christ I'll..." "Po." A flashlight beam hit him square in the face, blinding him. And a voice came from behind the light, calm, almost conversational, the kind of tone a doctor uses right before he tells you the cancer's spread. "You don't have a gun, Tommy. You have a wrench and a lot of regret. Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me where they're keeping Mrs. Johnson, and I'm going to decide whether you leave this garage on your feet or in a bag." The voice paused, letting the silence stretch like a noose tightening. "You've got 10 seconds to make the right choice, and I'm already at 7. Tommy's bladder nearly let go. He'd been part of the kidnapping, drove the second car. Stood lookout while they grabbed her, but he'd convinced himself it was just business. Just following orders. Nothing personal. Now, staring into that light with his pulse hammering in his temples, he understood with perfect clarity that business was about to get extremely personal. "I don't know where she is. I swear on my mother's grave. They didn't tell me nothing. I just drove the car." His voice cracked like a teenager's. "Please, man. I got kids. I got a wife who don't even know I'm mixed up in this." The light clicked off. Footsteps moved around him in the dark, slow, measured. The sound of someone who had all the time in the world and knew you had none. Then the voice again. Closer now. So close Tommy could feel breath on his neck. "You have kids. That's interesting. Because Mrs. Johnson is someone's wife too. And you didn't seem too concerned about that when you helped drag her out of a Cadillac and throw her in a basement somewhere." The voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Funny how morality works, isn't it? How it only shows up when your own neck is on the line." The garage door suddenly flew open, flooding the space with dawn light, and Tommy blinked against it like a man resurrected from the grave. He was alone. No one there. Just his tools scattered on the concrete and his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold a wrench if he tried. But pinned to his workbench with an ice pick driven so deep it cracked. The wood was a photograph of his daughter, walking home from school. No message. No threat. Just the photo, and the understanding that some lines, once crossed, turned your entire life into a countdown. By noon, every man who'd been in that warehouse was whispering to each other on payphones, their voices tight with paranoia. "You hear about Red. Someone got to him, didn't hurt him but left him a message. They know where his kid goes to school." And the responses came back strained. Defensive. How do they know we were careful? We didn't leave witnesses. But careful wasn't the same as invisible. And Bumpy Johnson had spent 30 years learning that the best way to destroy a conspiracy was to make the conspirators destroy themselves. That night, Gerald Finch, the one who'd suggested taking Mamie in the first place, woke to the smell of smoke. Not billowing, not choking. Just enough to make his eyes water and his lungs seize with the animal certainty that his house was burning, and he was about to die in it. He stumbled out of bed, crashed into the hallway, saw orange light flickering under the living room door, and heard the crackle of flames eating wood. His wife was screaming. His son was crying. And Gerald did what any terrified man would do. He kicked open the door, ready to drag his family through fire if he had to. The living room was fine. No flames, no smoke. Just a kerosene lamp sitting on the coffee table, burning bright and steady. And next to it a note written in careful block letters. Next time I won't knock first. Tell me where she is, or your family learns what real fire feels like. Gerald's knees buckled. He sat down hard on the floor, his wife clutching at him, demanding to know what was happening, who would do this. And all he could think was that he'd signed up to terrorize a black man's wife, and instead, he'd invited terror into his own home, into the one place where he was supposed to be safe, supposed to be powerful, supposed to be in control. By dawn of the second day, the KKK cell was fracturing like glass under a hammer. Phone calls in the middle of the night. Accusations hissed through clenched teeth. You talked, didn't you? You told someone. And the denials came back desperate, panicked. I didn't say nothing. Maybe you're the rat. Maybe you cut a deal. Fear spreads fastest when nobody knows what's true anymore, when every shadow might hide a traitor, and every friend might be the one who sells you out to save themselves. Marcus Webb watched it happen from his patrol car, parked across from a diner where two of the KKK members met at 3 in the morning. Their conversation visible through the window, even if he couldn't hear the words. He saw one man grab the other's collar, saw coffee cups knocked over, saw the kind of desperation that comes when you realize the hunter has become the hunted. Webb wrote nothing in his report, made no arrests, just watched the conspiracy eat itself alive and understood that sometimes justice doesn't come from courtrooms. It comes from making evil men so afraid of each other that they do the destroying for you. Bumpy Johnson stood in his office at 3 in the morning, staring at a banker's check made out for $50,000 a fortune. Unsigned. Delivered in a manila envelope that had been slipped under his door like a ransom note in reverse. No letter, no explanation. Just the check and the faint smell of expensive cologne. The kind worn by men who never got their hands dirty because they paid other people to bleed for them. He held it up to the light, examined the watermark that proved its authenticity, then set it on fire with his Zippo and watched it curl into black ash in the metal wastebasket. Freddie walked in, saw the smoke, and stopped cold. Boss, was that money? Bumpy didn't look up, just watched the flames die down to embers that glowed like dying stars. That was a bribe. Someone with real power just tried to buy me off, offered me cash to let this whole thing go. To pretend my wife getting kidnapped was just an unfortunate misunderstanding that can be smoothed over with a check and a handshake. He finally looked up, his eyes flat and dark as river stones. Which means this isn't just about the KKK anymore. This is about someone bigger. Someone who thinks money talks louder than blood. Raymond came in behind Freddie, holding a folder thick with papers, his face gray as old newsprint. Boss, you need to see this. I had our guy at City Hall pull records on the warehouse where we think they're operating. Properties owned by a shell company. Took me 2 days to trace it back. But I got names now. He spread the documents across the desk in corporation papers, tax filings, a web of legal entities designed to hide ownership like matryoshka dolls, hiding smaller dolls inside them. The money trail leads to 3 people: a real estate developer who's been trying to buy up Harlem properties for a decade, a city councilman who's been pushing urban renewal bills that would bulldoze half our neighborhood, and a lawyer who specializes in eminent domain cases. Raymond's finger stabbed at each name like he was marking graves. They're not trying to kill you, boss. They're trying to break you so they can buy Harlem out from under you piece by piece. Bumpy sat down slowly, his face carved from granite. And when he spoke, his voice had the finality of a judge reading a death sentence. So the KKK wasn't the real enemy. They were just the weapon, the blunt instrument. The men in hoods did the grabbing, but the men in suits gave the orders and wrote the checks. He stood up, walked to the window, looked down at Harlem sleeping under streetlights that barely kept the darkness at bay. And everyone, the cops, the mayor's office, the federal agents who could have shut this down in an hour, everyone knew or suspected. And everyone chose to look the other way, because powerful white men shaking down a black gangster doesn't register as a crime worth investigating. Freddie's voice came out rough, almost pleading. So what do? We can't fight City Hall. We can't fight developers with unlimited money and political connections. This isn't street war anymore, boss. This is Bumpy cut him off with a look that could have stopped a bullet. This is exactly what it's always been, a test of will. They think money and lawyers make them untouchable, the same way I used to think reputation and muscle made me untouchable. He turned back to face them. But here's what they forgot: I didn't build Harlem by playing by their rules. I built it by understanding that real power isn't about who has the most money or the best lawyers. Real power is about who's willing to go further than anyone else thinks is reasonable. He pulled out a clean sheet of paper and started writing names, not the KKK members, but the men behind them, the developer, the councilman, the lawyer. Each name written in careful block letters like an epitaph. We're not rescuing Mamie anymore. We're sending a message that'll echo for the next 50 years. You can't buy Harlem. You can't legislate it away. And you damn sure can't terrorize it into submission. He set down the pen with a finality that sounded like a cell door closing. From this moment on, this stops being about saving one woman and starts being about making sure no one white or black, rich or poor, hood or briefcase, ever thinks they can touch what's mine and walk away whole. Raymond stared at the list, then at Bumpy, and his voice came out barely above a whisper. Boss, if we go after these people, there's no coming back. They'll throw everything at us: police, feds, maybe even the military. This isn't a war we can win. Bumpy folded the paper, put it in his pocket, and smiled without an ounce of warmth. We're not trying to win. We're trying to make sure they lose harder. He walked to his desk, pulled out a bottle of bourbon that had sat unopened since Mamie disappeared, and poured 3 glasses. Gentlemen, what we're about to do isn't going to show up in any history book. It's not going to be celebrated or condemned officially because officially, it's not going to happen at all. But 50 years from now, when someone else tries to do what these men are trying to do, they're going to hear whispers about the 7 days in 1947, when someone tested Bumpy Johnson and learned that some lessons only need to be taught once. They drank in silence, each man understanding that they'd just crossed a line that separated ordinary criminals from the kind of men who shaped history from the shadows. Day 5 began with Gerald Finch running through the woods upstate, barefoot and wild-eyed, his expensive shoes abandoned somewhere in the darkness behind him, because shoes slowed you down, and he was running from something that didn't care about dignity or decorum. He'd been driving home from a secret meeting when his car died on a country road engine, cutting out clean, as if someone had flipped a switch. He'd sat there in the silence, listening to the woods breathe around him. And then he'd seen the flashlights moving through the trees, not searching, herding, driving him deeper into the forest like prey being pushed toward a cliff. He crashed through underbrush that tore his clothes and skin, his breath coming in ragged sobs. and his mind kept circling back to the same impossible thought. How did they know where I'd be? How did they know this road? This time, this exact moment when I'd be alone and vulnerable. He stumbled into a clearing and found himself face to face with a man he didn't recognize, tall, silent, holding a camera with a flash that went off like lightning, freezing Gerald's terrified face in silver halide permanence. Then the man lowered the camera and spoke in a voice as calm as Sunday morning. "That's the photo we'll send to your wife when you don't come home tomorrow. Or you can tell us where Mrs. Johnson is being kept, and we'll make sure you see your family again. Your choice. But you've got about 30 seconds before I stop being generous and start being creative." Gerald broke like cheap glass, gave them an address, gave them names, gave them the schedule of guard rotations and the location of the backup safe house. He gave them everything except his dignity, which he'd already lost somewhere between the abandoned car and the realization that powerful men only stay powerful as long as everyone agrees to pretend they are. When they let him go, shoved him toward the road and told him to walk, he collapsed on the shoulder and vomited until there was nothing left inside him but shame and the understanding that he'd just signed death warrants for men who'd trusted him. Day 6 brought Marcus Webb to Bumpy's office, his badge in one hand and his resignation letter in the other, and the look on his face said he'd aged a decade in a week. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep filing reports that go nowhere and pretending I don't know what's happening on these streets. The department knows where she is. Hell, half the force probably knew within 24 hours. He threw the badge on the desk like it was contaminated. But nobody moves because moving means choosing between you and the people who pay for campaign donations and pension funds. So here's what I know. And then I'm walking away before someone decides I know too much and need to disappear. Your wife is in a farmhouse 15 miles north of Yonkers. 3 guards. Concrete basement." Webb's voice dropped to something hollow and defeated. "They're planning to move her tomorrow night because they're hearing rumors that you're closing in, which means someone on your side or their side is talking too much and everyone's getting nervous." Bumpy picked up the badge, held it like he was weighing a man's entire career in his palm, then handed it back. "You're not resigning. You're taking a vacation. 2 weeks. Paid. And when you come back, you're not going to remember this conversation or anything that happens in the next 48 hours. You understand?" He leaned forward, his voice taking on the weight of prophecy. Because what's about to happen isn't going to show up in any police report, any newspaper, any official record. It's going to be one of those stories that people whisper about in bars 20 years from now. And when they do, you're going to be able to look them in the eye and say honestly that you don't know a damn thing about it. The final domino fell when the lawyer, the one who'd structured the shell companies and written the legal justifications for seizing Harlem properties, received a phone call at midnight. No threats, no demands. Just a voice reading him a list, the names of his children, their schools, their routes home. The time his wife went grocery shopping, the restaurant where his mistress worked, the offshore accounts he thought were buried so deep no one would ever find them. And when the voice finished, it said simply, "You have 12 hours to draw me a map showing exactly where Mrs. Johnson is and who's holding her. If that map is accurate, these names stay private. If it's not, or if you warn anyone, then tomorrow morning every newspaper in New York gets copies of your financial records and photographs of you entering that apartment on West 83rd Street every Tuesday at noon." The voice paused, letting the silence build like pressure in a sealed container. "Your choice: die with your reputation intact, or live as a man everyone knows is corrupt and broken." Clock's ticking. The map arrived by messenger at dawn on day 7. Hand-drawn in trembling pencil on legal paper, detailed enough to guide an invasion. Desperate enough to show that the lawyer understood exactly what happened to men who gambled with Bumpy Johnson's mercy and lost. It showed the farmhouse layout, the guard positions, the weak points in the perimeter, and most importantly, the exact location of the room where Mamie was being held. Bumpy spread it on his desk, studied it with the focused intensity of a surgeon planning an operation, and then looked up at his men with eyes that held no mercy and no hesitation. Gentlemen, tonight we finish this, not with rage, not with revenge, but with the kind of precision that makes people understand why you don't test a man who spent 30 years learning exactly how far he's willing to go. The back room of the Lenox Avenue office smelled like gun oil and cigarette smoke, and the particular tension that comes before men go to war, knowing some of them won't come back. Bumpy Johnson stood at the head of a table covered with the lawyer's hand-drawn map, photographs taken from surveillance, and a street layout marked with red circles showing entry points, sight lines, and the locations where bodies would fall if things went wrong. 6 men sat around that table, men who'd been with him through raids and arrests and turf wars that left entire blocks looking like war zones, and every one of them understood that tonight was different because tonight they weren't fighting for territory or respect. Tonight they were fighting to prove that certain lines couldn't be crossed without consequences that echoed through generations. Bumpy's finger traced the map with surgical precision, his voice low and controlled like a general briefing troops before a beach landing. The farmhouse sits on 12 acres with one access road leading in and out. That's our advantage and our trap. They chose isolation to keep her hidden, but isolation means they can't call for backup without someone hearing the call and deciding whether to risk their neck coming to help. He tapped the building's outline. 3 guards confirmed, 2 inside rotating shifts, 1 outside perimeter. They're expecting trouble, but they're not expecting us to come in quiet and professional. They're expecting rage. They're expecting a massacre. We're going to give them discipline instead. Raymond leaned forward, his scarred knuckles pressed against the table. Boss, with respect, these are the same men who put their hands on Mrs. Johnson. The same men who thought they could terrorize Harlem and walk away clean. You're asking us to show restraint when every instinct says we should burn that place down with them inside it. His voice carried the weight of shared anger, the kind that had been building for 7 days and wanted release like steam from a pressure cooker. Why not send the message loud and clear? Why not make sure everyone from here to Albany knows what happens when you come for what's ours? Bumpy looked at him with eyes that had seen more violence than most men could imagine, and had learned that violence without purpose was just butchery dressed in patriotism. Because that's exactly what they want. Raymond, they want us to be animals. They want to turn this into a bloodbath they can point to and say, "See, this is why people like Bumpy Johnson need to be put down like rabid dogs." They want justification for everything they're planning to do to Harlem, the seizures, the bulldozers, the urban renewal that's really just erasure with a prettier name. He straightened up, his voice dropping to something harder than iron. We go in surgical. We extract Mamie. We disable anyone who tries to stop us. But we don't execute men who are already beaten. Because the moment we become what they say we are, we lose. Not today. Not next week. But eventually. The system crushes monsters. It has a harder time crushing men who showed restraint when they had every reason not to. Freddie spoke up from the corner, his voice careful, testing the temperature of the room. And the men behind this, the developer, the councilman, the lawyer who drew us this map to save his own skin. What happens to them? They walk away while we're showing discipline and restraint. There was an edge to the question, a challenge wrapped in loyalty, and Bumpy recognized it for what it was, a test of whether the old lion still had teeth or had gone soft in his advancing years. Bumpy walked to the window, looked out at Harlem stretching away in every direction, and his reflection in the glass looked like a ghost of himself, older, harder, carrying weight that would have crushed weaker men decades ago. Those men are going to learn a lesson that's worse than death. They're going to learn that money doesn't make you untouchable, that political connections don't make you safe, that you can hide behind lawyers and shell companies and gentlemen's agreements all you want, but at the end of the day, there are still places in this city where the old rules apply, where a handshake means something and breaking it means everything. He turned back to face his men. They'll wake up tomorrow morning and realize that every business deal, every zoning hearing, every closed-door meeting from now until they die will happen with the understanding that I know where their children sleep, that I know which offshore accounts hold their retirement, that I could end them any time I choose, but I'm letting them live as a demonstration of mercy, and mercy can be withdrawn. The room went quiet except for the sound of breathing and the distant rumble of the city outside. Then Bumpy placed both hands on the table, leaning forward with the weight of his authority pressing down on everyone present. Tonight we get Mamie back. We do it clean. We do it fast. And we do it in a way that shows the world Bumpy Johnson doesn't need to become a monster to protect what's his. Because real power, gentlemen, the kind that lasts, the kind that builds dynasties, always has discipline. Always. The moment you lose that discipline, the moment you let rage do your thinking, you stop being a king and become just another thug waiting for someone smarter to put you in the ground. He straightened up, checked his watch 11:47 p.m. and picked up the .45 automatic that had been lying on the table like a promise. We leave in 13 minutes. Check your weapons. Say whatever prayers you believe in. And remember, we're not going there to kill. We're going there to teach. There's a difference, and that difference is what separates us from every other crew that thought muscle was enough to hold power. The farmhouse sat in darkness like a rotten tooth in the landscape. Its windows boarded, its paint peeling, surrounded by fields that hadn't seen crops in a decade. Bumpy and his men approached on foot through the tall grass, moving low and silent, their shadows merging with the night in a way that made them look less like men and more like something inevitable, like weather rolling in or consequences coming due. The single guard on perimeter patrol never saw them coming. One moment he was lighting a cigarette, squinting against the match flare, and the next moment Freddie's arm was around his throat, cutting off air and sound, while Raymond zip-tied his wrists and ankles and gagged him with a rag that smelled like kerosene and old fear. They stacked up outside the back door, 6 men moving with the coordinated precision of soldiers who'd trained together, bled together, and trusted each other enough to walk into hell knowing someone had their back. Bumpy gave the signal with 2 fingers raised, then one, then a closed fist, and they went through the door like water finding cracks in concrete fast, fluid, unstoppable. The first guard inside was sitting at a kitchen table playing solitaire with cards so worn they were almost transparent. He looked up, mouth opening to shout, and Bumpy's pistol barrel caught him across the temple hard enough that his head bounced off the table, and he slumped sideways like a puppet with cut strings. No shots fired, no alarms raised, just the wet sound of impact and the guard's cards scattering across the floor like prophecy. The second guard came down the stairs at a run, heard the commotion, had his revolver halfway out of his holster when Raymond hit him with a lead pipe that made a sound like a melon dropped from a roof. The man went down in a heap, breathing but unconscious, blood leaking from his scalp and spreading across the floorboards in a pattern that looked almost artistic in the dim light. Still no shots, still no massacre, just controlled violence applied with surgical precision to men who'd signed up for a kidnapping and were now learning that some job descriptions come with hidden costs. Bumpy moved to the basement door, pressed his ear against it, listened for any sound that would tell him Mamie was down there and alive. He heard nothing at first, just the silence that fills old houses late at night when all the decent people are asleep and only predators and prey are awake. Then he heard it, a faint cough, distinctly feminine, coming from somewhere below. His chest loosened fractionally. the first breath he'd taken easily in 7 days. And he opened the door and descended stairs that creaked like they were announcing his arrival to everyone in a 5-mile radius. The basement was concrete and shadow, lit by a single bare bulb that cast everything in harsh relief. Mamie sat in the corner on a folding chair, her wrists zip-tied to the armrests. Her face bruised, but her eyes still sharp and angry as broken glass. When she saw him, she didn't cry, or thank God, or show relief. She just looked at him with an expression that said, "What took you so long?" And Bumpy almost smiled because 7 days of captivity hadn't broken her. It had just made her more dangerous. He cut her free with a folding knife, helped her stand on legs that shook from days of limited movement, and was about to lead her upstairs when he heard the voice. It came from the darkness at the far end of the basement, smooth and educated, belonging to a man who still thought he had cards to play. "Mr. Johnson, I was hoping we could have a conversation before you leave, a negotiation, if you will, between reasonable men who understand that violence is expensive and cooperation is profitable." Bumpy turned slowly, his .45 hanging loose in his right hand, and saw him step into the light, the developer, the man whose money had funded this entire operation, still wearing a tailored suit at 2 in the morning like he'd come from a board meeting instead of an attempted kidnapping. He looked calm, almost amused, and he spread his hands in a gesture of peaceful intent that didn't match the hired muscle visible in the shadows behind him. "I'm prepared to offer you a substantial sum to walk away and forget this unpleasantness. Say, $200,000 and guaranteed immunity for all parties involved. You get your wife back. I get my business interests protected, and Harlem continues operating under your stewardship with no further interference." Bumpy stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a tomb door closing. "You really think this is about money? You really think I spent 7 days hunting your people, breaking your network, destroying your conspiracy, just so I could shake your hand and take a payoff like some street corner hustler who doesn't know his own worth?" He took a step forward. "Harlem isn't for sale. It wasn't for sale yesterday. It won't be for sale tomorrow. And the fact that you stood here in this basement where my wife has been held prisoner and offered me cash like you're buying a used car tells me you still don't understand what kind of mistake you made." The developer's smile flickered, died, and his hand moved toward his jacket pocket, maybe for a weapon, maybe for more money. It didn't matter. Bumpy's .45 came up faster than thought, and his voice cut through the basement like a blade through silk. Don't make me prove that I can show restraint, even when everything in me wants to put a bullet through your teeth. Take your muscle. Take your suit. Take whatever dignity you think you have left, and walk out of Harlem tonight knowing that I'm letting you live not because you deserve it, but because killing you would prove you right about what I am." The developer backed away, his composure cracking, and his hired men followed him up the stairs like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Minutes later, the farmhouse erupted in flames not from bullets or bombs, but from accelerant poured with purpose and lit with intention. As Bumpy led Mamie out into the night air that smelled like smoke and gasoline and burning lies, the building behind them collapsed inward with a roar that sounded like the earth swallowing evidence. No bodies inside, no witnesses left behind. Just fire doing what fire does best, erasing history and leaving only stories that people will whisper about when they think no one official is listening. 16 years later, in a coffee shop in Greenwich Village where the espresso was always too bitter and the intellectuals always too loud, a young journalist named Michael Brennan sat across from an older Bumpy Johnson and tried very hard not to show how nervous he was. Brennan had a tape recorder on the table between them, a notepad covered in shorthand, and questions he'd been rehearsing for a week because you didn't get many chances to interview a legend, and you definitely didn't get second chances if you screwed up the first. Mr. Johnson, I've been researching an incident from 1947, 7 days in February when your wife disappeared, and the KKK claimed responsibility. I've talked to retired cops, read through police archives, even interviewed some people who were living in Harlem at the time. Brennan leaned forward, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper. But here's what's strange, there's no official record. No arrest records, no trial, no bodies, just rumors and stories that don't quite line up. Some people say there was a fire. Some say men disappeared. Some say you negotiated a truce. Nobody agrees on the facts, which makes me think the real story got buried intentionally. Bumpy sipped his coffee black. No sugar. The way men who'd lived through harder times took everything, and his eyes held the kind of distance that comes from seeing too much history roll past and knowing which parts get written down and which parts get erased. You're right that it got buried. You're wrong about why. The story didn't disappear because someone hid it. It disappeared because everyone involved, cops, politicians, newspaper editors, even the people who were there understood that some stories are more dangerous written down than they are spoken in whispers. He set down the cup with a click that sounded like punctuation. You write that story. You make it official, and suddenly everyone has to take a position. Prosecutors have to decide whether to charge people. Politicians have to decide whether to condemn or condone. And most importantly, you create a blueprint that other people might try to follow. Brennan's pen hovered over his notepad. Not writing. Just waiting. So what really happened? Was it revenge? Was it a gang war? Was it... Bumpy cut him off with a look that could have stopped traffic. It was balance, not revenge. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is about making yourself feel better by making someone else feel worse. Balance is about making sure the world understands that certain actions have certain consequences, and those consequences are inevitable as gravity. He leaned back in his chair, his hands folded on the table like he was preparing to deliver testimony in a court that would never convene. Someone thought they could take something that belonged to me and use it as leverage to break me down, to prove that I was just another man who could be controlled through fear and loss. They thought wrong. But instead of just killing everyone involved and burning everything down, which would have been easy and satisfying and ultimately pointless, I made a choice to show discipline, to teach a lesson that would last longer than any body count. He continued, his voice carrying the weight of history itself. I let most of them live. Let them wake up every morning for the rest of their lives knowing they'd tried to destroy me and failed, and that I'd shown them mercy they didn't deserve and couldn't repay. Brennan wrote frantically, his handwriting barely legible, trying to capture words that felt like they were being spoken from some other era where honor and violence still walked hand in hand. And the men behind it, the financiers, the politicians, the ones who thought money would protect them. Bumpy's smile was thin as a knife blade. They learned that there are places in this country where money doesn't buy safety. It buys the illusion of safety. And illusions shatter when someone decides to stop pretending. Those men spent the next decade looking over their shoulders, wondering when I'd decide that mercy had an expiration date. Some of them moved away. Some of them had heart attacks before they hit 50. And some of them just faded into obscurity because they understood that staying visible meant staying vulnerable. The tape recorder kept spinning, capturing words that would never be published, that would sit in Brennan's files for decades until he was old enough to understand why some stories need to die with the people who lived them, because writing it down meant creating evidence, and evidence meant accountability. And accountability meant dragging Harlem through courts and hearings and public judgments that would help no one and hurt everyone. Brennan finally stopped writing, looked up, and asked the question he'd been holding back. Why talk to me at all if you don't want the story published? Bumpy stood up, dropped exact change on the table for his coffee, and adjusted his hat with the careful precision of a man who still believed presentation mattered. Because you needed to hear it. Because someday you'll be old enough to understand the difference between truth and facts, and you'll realize that not all truths belong in newspapers. And because in Harlem, we have rules that don't need to be written down to be understood. Rules about loyalty, about respect, about what happens when you cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. He walked toward the door, then paused and looked back one final time. You want the real story? Here it is. Power doesn't come from being the most violent or the most ruthless. It comes from being the most disciplined, from knowing when to strike and when to hold back, from understanding that the real victory isn't destroying your enemy, it's making them understand they never had a chance to begin with. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Brennan sat there staring at his notes, knowing he held a story that could make his career, and also knowing with absolute certainty that publishing it would be the last thing he ever did. So he labeled the tape, Johnson Interview, 1963, filed it away in a box that wouldn't be opened for 50 years, and went back to writing about safer subjects, city council meetings and traffic patterns, and the kinds of news that never got anyone killed. Because in Harlem, there are laws written in courtrooms and laws written in blood, and only a fool mistakes one for the other. This story never appeared in any newspaper, not because it didn't happen, but because there are truths that make writers disappear before the ink dries. The kind of history that gets filed away in boxes marked "Do Not Open" until everyone involved is dead and buried and past caring about reputation. If you want to keep hearing the stories they buried, the power moves they never reported, and the decisions that shaped American cities from inside the shadows where official history fears to look, hit that subscribe button. We're not here for entertainment. We're here to show you how power actually works when nobody's writing it down, when there's no law standing between ambition and consequence, when the only rule is survival.